If you're anything like me, you are impossible to watch a movie with because you're literally always complaining about how historically inaccurate the costumes are. But that's actually a huge mystery. Why do some costume designers choose to make inaccurate costumes? These people know all about fashion history and have huge budgets, so surely they could be historically accurate if they wanted to, right? So if these costumers choose inaccuracy, it must have a deeper meaning for the films in question. So let's have a look at the different types of choices costumers can make, starting with number 1. The zero effort. Now this practically never happens now, but it did actually used to happen a lot in old Hollywood. This is when there is literally no way of telling that a costume drama is a costume drama. Let's take the example of It's a Wonderful Life. Now this isn't probably what you're picturing when you think of a period drama, right? It's more of a Christmas movie. But in fact, it spans over a couple of decades. It's just that we don't think about it because it's not the main point of the movie. For those of you who haven't seen the film, it follows the story of this guy named George. He's a really nice guy and he begins his life in the 20s by wanting to travel, see the world, have new experiences. Over time, life gets in the way and he ends up being really bitter and resentful and sad. So the story isn't really about the experience of living in the 20s versus the experience of living in the 40s. It's about an individual journey and finding out what really matters to you. The film isn't really about him specifically or the time specifically, it's about all of us and what happens in our minds when things don't go quite as we wanted them to and how easy it is to lose hope. So from the point of view of period drama accuracy, the film is really zero effort. However, it's not at all lazy costuming, it's just that the historical aspect didn't really bring much to the film that wasn't already there. Other films of this type might include Three Little Words, The Dolly Sisters, The Roaring Twenties, and Words in Music. Let's continue with the second choice a costumer can make, in other words, full immersion into another time, the complete opposite. This is what the most realistic period dramas do. They literally make you forget that you are living in your own time. The problem that they sometimes face is being perhaps a little bit boring. One great example of that is A Room with a View. The film is set in the 1900s, it's got very natural acting, lighting, extremely minimal makeup, and the costumes are some of the most realistic that I personally have ever seen. While some films would choose to glamorize that era, A Room with a View shows it as it is, in other words, kind of boring, which is part of the point. If you haven't seen it, the film is about a girl named Lucy who's living a really conventional life as a young, respectable lady. She always says and does the right thing, and she gets engaged to a nice, boring, respectable man. The problem is, she's actually in love with a guy who's a bit of a rebel. I mean, seriously guys, he plays with his food. So the choice of full immersion isn't just the costumers showing off about how much homework they did, it's actually about showing a rather boring, conventional world that the heroine wants to escape, and the hyper-realism is part of what makes it boring and therefore perfect for the film. These types of film not only take into account the reality of the lines and models of clothing that were worn, but they take into account lighting, natural textures, makeup, hair, and so much more than just the costumes to give it an extremely realistic feel. Even when some of the costumes are not considered beautiful by contemporary standards, they still include them for the sake of realism. These films are generally praised for their realism, but the problem is, if they make even one tiny little mistake, it is immediately visible. And yes, whoever put the plastic bottle on the set of Downton Abbey, I'm talking to you. Other great films that are part of this category would be The Age of Innocence, Out of Africa, The King's Speech, Barry Lyndon, and The Crown. Let's move on to option number 3. Full immersion with a hint of idealization. This is pretty much the same as full immersion, in other words, everything is cohesive and everything fits in the time period, but it just looks a lot better. It just looks a lot more glamorous and beautiful. These films do that by taking sources that are already idealized, such as paintings of rich people, for example. Once they've chosen these sources that are already idealized, they're going to make them even more idealized by adding colors that are fashionable in their time, textures and fabrics that are fashionable in their time, and obviously by removing anything that by contemporary standards is ugly. The original Sissy trilogy does this incredibly well. The costumes are inspired by the costumes of the real Empress, but the entire movies give the impression of a carefully curated hoop-skirt fashion show. This is exactly what the film sought to create. The film wasn't about realism, it was about escapism. The films were done partly in the tradition of the German Heimat film, excuse my accent, a type of film that sought to bring back an idealized past after the, let's face it, pretty troubled era of the 1940s. So the film was really meant to allow you to just escape your reality and dream of a better past. It wasn't meant to be entirely realistic. In fact, this type of costuming isn't so much inaccurate as it is incomplete. It usually only tells the story story of beautiful, upper-class, rich people, and so it kind of makes sense that it's very idealized. Another thing is that this type of costuming isn't necessarily made for escapism. Sometimes you can have a really dark story and it'd be contrasted by really idealized costumes to create a really, sometimes chilling effect. Think of the most recent Great Gatsby. Other examples might include Lady Hamilton, Madame du Barry, The Seahawk, Gone with the Wind, and Bridgerton. Now, the fourth type of choice that can be made is probably one of the most common nowadays, and that is selective immersion. In these types of films, most characters are really realistically represented, but there are a couple of them that are really anachronistic, and they're usually the main characters. There are two main reasons why costumes do this. In the olden days, it tended to be to make the heroine or hero more palatable to contemporary standards. For example, in Brigadoon, Sitcha Reese mysteriously has 50s bobbed hair while everyone else has long hair, and in Wings, Clara Bow sports decidedly 20s fashion while it's actually set in World War I. Nowadays, filmmakers usually do it to make the character appear closer to us, not only visually but psychologically. For example, take the 2005 Pride and Prejudice. The films are overall very realistic, but if you look at Elizabeth, she's got like a very simple bun, she wears the most simple clothes, and she looks kind of the least period of the entire film, whereas negative characters like Miss Bingley or Lady Catherine look really outlandish and weird. If we compare to the 1995 version, there's way less of a difference between Lizzie and the other characters. The reason why they chose to make such a big difference in this movie is probably to show that she's a woman of today. She's very modern and she doesn't really resonate with the people in her time that much. It's also to make the identification with her easier because it's obviously way easier to identify with someone who looks like you. Moving on now to the next choice that costume designers can make. Fictional immersion, a really interesting one in my opinion. When this happens, the movie transports you to a different time, but that time never really existed. It's all fictional, or it's a mix of different eras, different styles, but it kind of looks so cohesive that we're actually completely happy believing in it. Let's have a look at a film that is, I think, one of the best costume-wise, the 1970 Donkey Skin. So Donkey Skin is a 17th century fairy story, so the main influence of the costumes is 17th century. We have the huge puff sleeves and the huge gowns. However, there's like a mix of so many periods in this. There's a lot of Renaissance influence, a little bit of medieval influence, and with the very camp accessories and the very exaggerated bright and pastel colors, it looks very late 60s, early 70s. But interestingly, it all does it in a way that's so seamless and blends beautifully together that after 5 minutes, you've basically forgotten that this is not a real period of time, and you just believe it because it is so beautifully done together. And the film even makes fun of itself in that way, because the character of the fairy godmother, she comes from the future, basically. So her silhouettes are much more 1930s, and it's also really cool to have that distance between this one character and everybody else. This is perfect for Donkey Skin because it's obviously a children's film. Once again, it provides escapism. In fact, the movie kind of works like a dream. In other words, an amalgamation of a bunch of things you thought of during the day that do not technically go together, but while you're experiencing them, you really believe them. The film also heavily relies on the contrast between, obviously, the donkey skin, which is, kind of gross, versus the beautiful magical dresses that the princess wears at different points of the story. In fact, the contrast between the dresses and the donkey skin wouldn't have been as strong if it had just relied on real period pieces from the 17th century. Other examples of this might be the 60s Cleopatra, the 40s Beauty and the Beast, and of course, Game of Thrones. Now let's have a look at the last type of choice that a costumer can make, and which is of course compatible with any of the 5 others that I mentioned before. To understand this, let's have a look at what costumer Anais Roman says about it. She says, working on period dramas doesn't mean copying the exact clothes that were worn at the time. In fact, it always means saying something about our time. So this choice is about not so much an immersion into a different time, but presenting a distorted reflection of our time. This generally happens when a particular era is going through a nostalgia of whatever era. Sometimes costume dramas can also mirror contemporary times as a deliberate choice rather than a trendy choice. One of the films that does it so well is the 2005 Marie Antoinette. Now overall, this film would go into, I suppose, the full immersion plus idealization Idealisation category, but there are actually a few anachronisms there that aren't just to make the costumes look prettier by our standards, but that are actually meant to draw parallels between contemporary times and their time. The film was based on a couple of biographies of Marie Antoinette, so clearly it's not through lack of knowledge that they chose to be anachronistic at some points. They were trying to make a parallel between your average, bored, lonely trophy wife and Marie Antoinette. Now, while I may not be very morally comfortable with the idea of presenting excessive spending as relatable at a time when French people literally had nothing to eat,
nothing. I got absolutely nothing to say.
I do have to give it to the film that they were really good at telling a cohesive anachronistic story, be it through the acting, the occasional pink hair for no reason, the soundtrack, the converse. Everything looks kind of right, and then all of a sudden something becomes wrong, and that keeps you on your toes and it makes you think about the role of accuracy in film, which is really cool. Obviously, the trend aspect also had a role to play in this. In fact, you can see that the fashion resonated so well with the early 2000s that Galliano made a Marie Antoinette themed collection in 2006. Other movies in this category might be Cabaret, Chicago, and Singing in the Rain. Before moving into my final thoughts on the subject, if you enjoyed this video and would like to encourage me to make more like this, I suggest you subscribe, it might just work. Now, to finish off, did you notice how our relationship to historical accuracy is dramatically changing? You may have observed that the tendency for full immersion was virtually non-existent in old Hollywood. Even when a film was set 15 years before it was made, the costumers made very little effort to make it look historically accurate. Nowadays, we're seeing a lot more extreme realism and full immersion, at least in the past 50 years. We're also seeing more deliberate anachronisms that aren't meant to just look better by our standards, but are meant to say something about the film. Let me know in the comments, why do you think our relationship to historical accuracy has changed, and if you'd like me to do a video about it, I'd also be happy to do it. Thank you for watching, guys. See you later.